My name is Jason Marsh. I am the Director of Programs at the Greater Good Science Center at the University of California, Berkeley. And my colleague, Vicki Zakrzewski, and I are incredibly pleased and honored to be joining the ISB community for this week and engaging in a really lively and thoughtful and exciting dialogue with students and faculty and now parents as well. So we're really honored and grateful to be so welcomed and so engaged in your community for this week. Thanks very much to all of you for having us, especially to Braun and Andy and Elizabeth and many other members of the staff here who just made us feel so welcome and we've really enjoyed getting to know and work with. So our center is a little bit unusual from other centers at University of California, Berkeley, and elsewhere. Just out of curiosity, is anyone here familiar with the Berkeley, Bay Area, San Francisco area, Northern California? Yes, a lot, like 18, 19%. That's great. And so as you know, we, UC Berkeley, huge institution. Our center within it is a little bit unusual in that we fund some research on essentially the roots of pro-social as opposed to antisocial behavior. So what is it that makes people do good, makes them compassionate, altruistic, as well as what makes them lead happy, meaningful lives. We cover what we call the science of a meaningful life. And we do that not only by funding research, but in a way that's different from a lot of other centers at Berkeley and around the world, is we take that research and we translate it into terms that are practical and accessible to people outside of academia. So especially for educators and parents and health professionals, so that the research can actually have real practical utility and make an impact out in the world. We do that through a variety of channels. One is through our website, Greater Good, which is an online magazine. We publish every day pretty much articles and videos, quizzes, other types of multimedia resources to make the science a little bit more fun and engaging and understandable, but also through events and workshops that we put on, consulting with various groups around the country, around the world, as well as through a summer institute for educators that Vicki has led now for the last 3 summers, and which we were privileged to have many teachers from ISB attend this past summer. So in all those ways, our work is intended to engage educators and parents and others who really want to know how the science can actually be made useful to their own lives to improve their own well-being as well as the well-being of those that they love and care for, like their children or students or patients, which is very much at the heart of the presentation that Vicki will be sharing with you today. So Vicki is our education director. She has an incredible range of experience and wisdom that she has gathered. She is both a former teacher and school director who then went on to earn her PhD in psychology with a special focus on our field, what we call positive psychology and education, as well as organizational psychology, and understanding how these principles for wellness and well-being can actually be cultivated within organizations, especially in educational institutions. And she has really been able to leverage that knowledge in her work consulting with groups around the world, and now we've been very fortunate in the last 3 years to have her sharing and spreading that knowledge from the Greater Good Science Center. So please welcome Vicki Zakrzewski.
Okay, hear me? Yes? Okay. Before I start, I just want to get a sense of who all of you are. You're all parents of the children here, yes? And how many of you have a child in kindergarten through 5th, or I should say pre-K through 5th grade, elementary? How many middle school? High school? How many of you have them anywhere pre-K, I would say a mixture of that? You've got more than one? Yes. Okay, all right, great. It's good for me to know that. So I just want to add my gratitude to Jason's. It is so wonderful to be here. I cannot tell you what a wonderful time we've had here in Bangkok and at ISB. Never received such a warm welcome from the school here, from Andy, from Ron, from Elizabeth, from Graham, and from many others. And so it's just a privilege for us to be here. As I go through this presentation, I'm going to be talking about things, but I'm also going to be asking you to actually try some of these activities based on the science so that you get a real sense of what this science looks like and can maybe get a sense of the impact of what this science can have on yourself personally and possibly on your children as well. So before I start the formal presentation, I'd like to take you through an exercise to give you a sense of what this means, this translating the science into action. So the exercise is turning to a person sitting next to you and taking turns, maybe about 30 seconds, a minute each, describing one great thing that happened to you this week. What happened? Who was there? How did it make you feel? As you're describing it to the person sitting next to you, really try to relive it. Try to get that sense of what it felt like to have this positive experience, this one great thing that happened to you. And when I'm ready to pull you back, I've got a little chime here. So when you hear the chime, that's the time to end your conversations and come back. Okay, so we'll take about a couple minutes to do that exercise, turning to the person sitting next to you. By telling each other these experiences, you got a boost of positive emotions. Maybe you feel a little bit happier than when you came in. And also, hopefully, you feel a little bit more connected with each other. So what this exercise is designed to do is to do both of those things, give us that boost of positive emotions and to connect us with one another. And the reason I do that at the beginning of a workshop is that it helps to set up a safe learning environment. We know from the research, kids, when they enter the classroom, if they feel happy, if they feel safe, if they feel connected to each other in addition to their teachers, they're going to be able to learn better. We know that positive emotions make us more creative. We're able to think out of the box more. They energize us. Whereas negative emotions, if a student feels anxious or nervous, that tends to shut down their thinking. There literally is a change that happens in their brain, and that prefrontal cortex, which is where we have all of our executive functions, our decision making, our thinking skills, it starts to shut down, and we can't think as well when we feel those negative emotions. So doing a simple exercise like this for teachers in class, you can do this at home with your children as well. Just ask them, what's one great thing that happened? It creates that sense of connection, that sense of positive, that feeling of positive emotions. So that's an example of the science in action, super simple. You know, it's the stuff we already know intuitively, but for some reason having the science makes it much more intentional for us. As we go along, I know there are a lot of you, but in general, I like to take questions as we go along, as long as we don't get too railroaded on the topic. Because I have a lot I like to do, and I usually run out of time at the end for Q&A. So if you've got questions as we go along, go ahead and just ask them. All right, so the topic that we're going to be covering today is using the science of a meaningful life to cultivate social and emotional well-being in children. So first of all, the question is, what exactly is social and emotional learning and social emotional well-being? So on your table, hopefully those of you in the back, you've all got a handout that's got the multicolors, orange, blue. What that shows is this is the framework that in general education uses for social and emotional learning. And you'll see that it's divided into 5 different components. The first in the red is self-management and self-awareness. So self-awareness is being able to recognize your own emotions, your values, and self-management is being able to, very generally, being able to handle your emotions, being able to work with them in a very healthy way. Then you come down here to the blue quadrants. These are more socially oriented. So this is social awareness. This is being able to recognize other people's emotions. And relationship skills, being able to cultivate healthy, positive relationships. And then responsible decision making is using these things to make good decisions in our lives. This is the framework that the education field uses when they're talking about social and emotional learning. They're teaching skills in these different areas because we've learned from the research that we can actually teach these things. We can teach our children, we can teach ourselves how to recognize emotions in ourselves, in other people. We can learn things like empathy. We can learn how to deal with conflict in a very healthy way. We can learn to calm down our emotions. So all of these things work together to help our students be more socially and emotionally balanced. And I'll talk in just a moment about what that means for the field of education and for the learning process. But as I mentioned, you've got this handout. What I'd like you to do is just take a look at that handout. You'll see you've got these 5 quadrants, and underneath each one of those quadrants is a little bit of a deeper description of maybe what self-awareness looks like or what social awareness looks like. And then there's one extra box that says positive school culture. That's one that you don't have to look at right now. But I'd like you to look at that handout and consider for yourself, which of these skills have you used today? What have you used today? And if you'd like to talk about it with the person sitting next to you, go ahead and do that. Where have you used these skills today in your life? Most people have. So the reason I like to do this exercise is just to show, a lot of times we take these things for granted, that we're doing these things, that these are part of our lives. But when they become much more intentional, we're able to use them in a healthier way and actually realize the impact that these skills have on our lives. So why is this important for school, for life? In general, there are 3 arguments, three research-based arguments that the experts use for why social-emotional learning, why social-emotional skills are important. The first is what they call the economic argument. So this is about job skills. If you look at what employers wanted the most in the 1970s, they wanted the top three skills that they wanted in their employees were reading, writing, and computational skills. If you look now, the top three skills that they want are teamwork, perseverance, and communication skills. So completely different. Those are the kinds of skills that social-emotional learning can teach. Also, people who have these social-emotional skills, they tend to be more successful in their jobs as well. So that's the economic argument. Also, there's the educational argument. So this is students, the researchers show that students who have these skills tend to be much more successful academically. If you think about it, if you're not bothered by anxiousness, by being scared, whatever it might be of what's going on in your learning, you're going to be able to learn much, much better because your emotions are calmed down. So you tend to do better in your classes. Also, students who have these skills, they get along better with their teachers. They also have better relationships with their friends as well. The next argument is the societal argument. There actually was a longitudinal study done where they looked at children who at the age of 12 had learned these social-emotional skills. They followed them to the age of 27. They were much more successful both in their educational and in their vocational attainment as well. So they were more successful in school and more successful in their work. So it has a long-term impact. Also, if you can imagine, people who have these skills, eventually it's going to create a much more humane, compassionate society as well. Now, there's one more argument that we at the Greater Good Science Center like to use, and that's what we call the human argument. So these social-emotional skills, they lay the foundation for cultivating meaningful and happy lives. And we've also found, when you look at the research on meaning and happiness in our lives, it's found that they're linked to all of these things. So people who have a sense of meaning, who are happy in their lives, they're more successful in their work. Also, kids who are happy and see the meaning in what they're actually doing in their academic work, they're more successful in education as well. And then finally, people who have a sense of happiness, a sense of meaning, they tend to have greater harmony in their societies as well. So that's the human argument for why we have why social-emotional learning is so important. Okay. Also, a really interesting study came out last year that looked at what the most important childhood predictors of life satisfaction were in adulthood. So what was it that children were getting in their childhood that led to their greater well-being? They found that there were two factors. The two most important factors were emotional health and prosocial behavior. Prosocial behavior in general meaning kind, helpful behavior. So they were emotionally healthy, and they also were able to cultivate good relationships. Interestingly, the least important factor in childhood that predicted life satisfaction in adulthood, anyone want to guess?
Academic.
Yep. Academic success. Now, this does not mean that that is not important. It is important, absolutely, of course. But these two things it's about relationships. So much of our lives is about how do we get along with others in the workplace, in our families, in our communities. So I just like to show this as, there's a lot of fuel to why we need to be cultivating these things in our children. So where do we start in terms of cultivating social-emotional well-being in our children? Well, I like to start because it's actually it's creating a new view of human development. How do we actually develop as human beings? Historically, I would say actually probably the last 150 years, particularly since Darwin came out, we've had this idea that we are innately competitive, that it's all about survival of the fittest. It's about getting ahead. It's all about me surviving and not you. Well, Dr. Dr. Keltner, who's a professor at Berkeley, who's also the faculty founding member of the Greater Good Science Center, went into Darwin's literature and he looked at it and he said, you know what? That's actually a misinterpretation of Darwin. What Darwin actually said was that we need sympathy to succeed in this world. We need to connect with each other in order to survive. So it's actually that power of connection is more important than that sense of competition as well. And then he started looking at all of the research and doing his own research to see, are we naturally wired to actually connect with each other? And he said, yes, we are. He found that we connect with each other through our voice. We connect with each other through touch. Our brains are wired to feel another person's pain. When you wire two people up in the lab, with one person, you prick their finger and cause pain. Their pain center lights up in the brain. The other person who did not get a pinprick, but who saw the other person feel pain, their pain center lit up as well. So that's empathy. So we are just exquisitely wired to connect with each other. And he said one of the ways that we really connect with each other is through emotions, particularly the positive emotions. And he writes in his book, Born to be Good, the origins of human goodness are rooted in our emotions, and these social instincts may be stronger than those of any other instinct or motive. So he's not negating the fact that we have that competitive side, that survival of the fittest. We absolutely have that in ourselves, but we also have this other side as well. And he's arguing that that actually may be stronger in us than the competitive side. So you've got researchers now who are starting to look at, well, how young can we start to see these pro-social tendencies? And so there's this incredibly wonderful research that's happening now where they're looking at children as young as 13 months. See, do they show pro-social tendencies? Do they show compassion? Do they show kindness to others? And so this is Dr. Felix Warneken. He's out of Harvard University, and he's conducting a lot of these studies. And he's finding that, yes, children that young actually show these kinds of tendencies. So I just want to show you a very brief video of some of these experiments that he's done, just to show you the impact. Show you what he's found. Wait, let me second. Is that happening? You know, hold on one second. Let me go back because it looks like it's slow. I want to make sure you guys get the whole thing. Okay, let's try that again. Here we go. So obviously the child's going to be good. Well, they repeated the experiments with the parent outside the room, and they found that the same exact thing happened as well. Also there was another study done that showed that encouraging kindness is so incredibly easy at this young age. And before I explain this, I just want to make one more point with what Felix Warneken was doing. He was doing it at that young of age before the social expectations can actually set in, before children really have a sense of what is socially expected of them. So again, making the research that much more powerful. So for this study, 18-month-olds were used for this study, and they were shown one of these four pictures. So either the two dolls facing each other, one doll by herself, two dolls facing away from one another, or the blocks. And what they found was that the children who saw the picture of the two dolls facing each other were 3 times more likely to spontaneously help another person. So it just goes to show you that it's just a simple suggestion of kindness, of cooperation, of connection that can encourage that side of ourselves to actually come out. So then what does this new view of human development, this paying attention to our social and emotional well-being, our sense of connection with each other actually mean for the learning process? Well, there have been some really major implications. You know, for years and years, we were focused just on cognitive development because that's all that the researchers paid attention to. They thought emotions were just this kind of thing to ignore. They don't really matter, they don't really impact us. So about 40 years ago, a researcher at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Dr. Richie Davidson, started looking at emotions, putting his career on the line. He was told, you're going to be completely ruined if you study emotions. Thank goodness he forged ahead. And after 40 years of research, we've discovered some really, really amazing things about emotions. And what he says is that emotions really help us navigate the world, navigate our relationships, navigate our organizations, our decision making. A child, emotions really matter in learning because emotions play a role in a child's ability to pay attention, to learn, to have empathy for others, also their motivation as well. If you consider a student who wants to do well on a math test, why does that child want to do well on a math test? Do they want to please the parents? Do they want to please the teachers? Do they just love math and they want to do well for the sake of that love? Do they want to get into a good university? What's the reason? Whatever that reason is, there's an emotion behind it as well. Also, there was another very interesting study done with 4th and 5th graders in math achievement. And they looked at the relationship between math achievement, self-control, and peer acceptance. And what they found was that both self-control and peer acceptance correlated positively with math achievement, meaning that it wasn't just that the student could sit there and do the math. It also really mattered to them what their relationships were like with their peers. Did they feel accepted? Did they feel connected? Did they feel like they belonged as well? So some researchers are even going so far as to say that the learning process is 50% cognitive and 50% social and emotional. So something we really have to pay attention to. Now, what happens when we don't pay attention to the emotional aspect of our children, of our students? So these are statistics from the American College Health Association from 2013. They surveyed American college students from all over the U.S., from all over the country, and just kind of assessing where they are mentally, what their mental health was like. And what they found was that about 51% felt anxiety, severe anxiety, 45% felt somewhat hopeless, 30% were so depressed they could hardly function. Other things too, they saw a lot of substance abuse, eating disorders, self-injury, that sort of thing. And what the researchers were saying was that this is not just because they're in university. This didn't start when they were in university. Our emotional development starts the minute we're born, and some people are saying it actually starts before we're born, when we're in utero. So this is something that happens through a child's development, through the whole span of development. They learn these emotional skills, or they don't. So some other reasons they say that these kinds of things are happening is, of course, the pressure of tests, also the pressure to get into really good universities. But then taking that even deeper, they're saying that a lot of these children, a lot of these students are equating their self-worth with their academic success, meaning that if they don't succeed academically, then that really harms their self-worth, which is a global evaluation of who you are. So if they don't succeed academically, they consider themselves to be a bad person. That's a lot different than if you just say, okay, I failed on a test and that means I just need to study harder, or maybe I didn't get it, or whatever it may be. When you equate it with that you are an actually bad person, that's when you start to get into some of these mental health issues. And the final reason that some of the researchers are talking about with this happening is they're equating their parents' love with their academic success. They think their parents' love is conditioned on whether or not they are successful academically, whether or not that's actually true. That's just what they think. And so if they don't succeed, they feel like they're not going to have their parents' love, and also their teachers' love as well. So again, these are just reasons why some of these statistics actually might be happening. So again, the real importance of having to pay attention to the social and emotional lives of our children. So then the question becomes, what side of ourselves do we actually cultivate? This is actually a term, homo economicus. Do we cultivate that selfish, that competitive, that drive to succeed at any cost side of ourselves? Or do we cultivate the side of ourselves that's connected, that's compassionate, that's altruistic, that also has the outcomes of what you would expect from homo economicus in terms of success in their jobs, success in their work life, success in their families, in their communities as well. Okay, so when we're thinking about the social emotional skills, this is a slide I like to show to teachers. but it says, "Can you help me, Mrs. Martin?" This wasn't covered in any of my education courses. But it's really important for us as the adults who are guiding our children is that these social and emotional skills are not just for our children. They have to see us actually model them as well. And given how new the teaching of these skills actually is in school, I would say most of us did not get this in school. I mean, we were very fortunate. We happened to get it at home, but a lot of us didn't get it at home either. And it's a lifelong process. Cultivating those social emotional skills, it's not just a one-off lesson. It's something that you have to do on a daily basis. And as our situations change, we may need different social and emotional skills. So how you behave at work may be very different with how you interact with what you need to do to interact with a difficult family member or with your family in general. With teachers, I often like to use the example that you start by teaching 11th grade and then you get switched to kindergarten, and those social emotional skills that you need are going to be very, very different. So again, it's this is a lifelong process where we have to continually be developing these in ourselves as well. So where do we start with all of this? At the Greater Good Science Center, we actually like to start with happiness. And the reason we start with happiness is because when you ask people, what do you want most in life? Or what do you want most for your children? Or most for your students? A lot of them say, I just want to be happy. I just want my children to be happy. Are you familiar with Paul Tough's book, How Children Succeed? Did that make it over here at all? Or is that, no, okay, all right, then that was something. Anyway, Paul Tough he's an American author, and he wrote a book about these social emotional skills, and so he went all over the country and he asked parents and teachers, what do you want most for your children and your students? And they all said the same exact thing, we just want them to be happy. He said, but the difference was they all disagreed on how you actually get there. So now there's a whole science of happiness, and researchers are studying happiness all over the world to figure out what actually cultivates happiness in our lives, and can we cultivate it? So the definition we use is the experience of joy, contentment, or positive well-being combined with a sense that one's life is good, meaningful, and worthwhile. So it's not just about having those positive emotions. It's also about the sense that your life has a sense of meaning as well. And we know from the research on happiness that people in general who are happy, they are more successful in all areas of their life, and they also enjoy greater well-being, greater health and well-being. Students as well. So a few caveats, though, about happiness I want to point out that the researchers are just starting to come out with. The first is that they found that the pursuit of happiness actually makes us less happy. So if you make happiness a goal, you're going to make yourself miserable. Because you're going to be thinking, oh my gosh, I'm not happy, what's wrong with me? That'll make yourself crazy. So you don't want to make it a goal. Rather, it's about doing things that bring that sense of meaning, that boost of positive emotions in your life. Also, positive emotions and extremes can be very problematic. So you think about teenagers who can get on these super, super highs, and then they go off and they do really crazy behavior. Again, you don't want to have those super highs. And then finally, negative emotions are just part of life. It's not that you want to have positive emotions all the time. We have such a rich emotional life, and positive and negative emotions are part of it. And so it's really about learning how to work with your emotions in a very rich, balanced, healthy way. So in terms of actually cultivating happiness, what the researchers have found is that about 10% of our levels of happiness or 10% of our levels of happiness are controlled by our life circumstances, about 50% by our genes, but then 40% by our daily activities, which actually is good news because that means there's a lot we can do to bring this into our lives. So then how do we actually do that? Well, the researchers have found there are really three main ways that people cultivate happiness in their lives. The first is called a hedonic treadmill. So this is doing things that give you that little boost of positive emotions. So it might be eating that really delicious piece of chocolate cake, or buying a fancy new car, or taking a fantastic vacation, or whatever it might be, even smaller little things. So just to get that boost of positive emotions. The thing is, though, is that those emotions don't last. So you have to continually do things in order to get that sense, that feeling of positive emotions. And what researchers say, if you rely on that, then that's where you start getting on a treadmill, where you have to keep doing these things. And so it's not a reliable way for happiness. The next is flow. So this is a term that was coined by a professor named Mahalay Csikszentmihalyi. And flow is that state of being where you become so absorbed in what you're doing that you lose all sense of time and place. He found that artists have it a lot, rock climbers have it a lot, scientists have it a lot. And the sense of happiness really comes after the state of flow when you come out of it. The challenge with that, though, is it's very difficult to actually live our lives in a state of flow. So the most reliable way that researchers have found to cultivate happiness is a meaningful life, is cultivating a meaningful life. And that means the feeling that my life and experiences, they make sense and they matter. So, a little tricky though, because how do you actually, what constitutes a meaningful life? I mean, so many of us these days, we have so much freedom to actually decide how to live our lives, how to give ourselves meaning, that a lot of people feel like they're kind of unmoored and they don't really know what to do. So, but I'm going to ask you just for a minute to close your eyes or look at a spot on the floor in front of you and think about your life and where do you find meaning in your life? What gives you meaning? Gives you a sense of meaning, that your life makes sense and that it matters. To you and just share with them maybe one or two places where you find meaning in your life. So relationship to yourself, to those close to others, and then to the larger as well.
And they each one has different expectations and different ways to get your feeling of happiness.
Okay, great, thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
When you feel that you can contribute either to the society, to your family, or someone else.
Okay, so contributing outside yourself as well. Okay, one more person. Anyone else? Want to share? Yes. Something creative. Okay, doing something creative. Okay, all these answers are exactly what the researchers have found about what constitutes a meaningful life. So doing something creative, feeling that you can make a difference in the world, feeling that you're connected to something larger than yourself. Spirituality can give people a lot of meaning. I think the one topic that, or the one area that they found that really gives most people meaning is their relationships. So the relationships to other people is just huge in terms of giving a sense of meaning. And that's interesting because in addition to that, it's not just relationships, it's what those relationships are like. So a recent study found that prosociality, so reaching out to other people and being kind and helpful, adds a tremendous amount of meaning to our lives. And ultimately, what they found is that when we cultivate these things within ourselves, these good qualities in ourselves, when we cultivate compassion and gratitude and forgiveness in ourselves, we actually are helping cultivate that in other people. So when people see us expressing gratitude, they're encouraged to express gratitude as well. So it's helping bring out those good qualities in other people. And they found that that is actually what gives us the greatest sense of meaning, is bringing that out in ourselves, but also helping to bring it out in other people as well. So, in terms of cultivating a meaningful life, we've kind of lumped it into 3 different categories, and this is just our framework. We look at the commitment to the greater good, so to something larger than ourselves, and then our self-awareness, our self-management, our social awareness, and our relationship management. So really integrating these concepts of social emotional learning, social emotional well-being into cultivating a meaningful life as well. So I'm going to start by looking at the commitment to the greater good, because it's really important to know, why are you doing this? Why are you cultivating these skills? Why are our children cultivating these skills? It's really important to have that sense of purpose. And that's the first thing I want to talk about, is purpose, which is just starting to get a lot of attention in the research, and particularly in education, and what role it plays in education. Because in general, we haven't focused a whole lot in education on helping our students cultivate a sense of purpose in their life. So the way the researchers define it is, it's something that's meaningful to you that also serves the greater good. It serves something larger than yourself. So they found that students who have a sense of purpose, they tend to be psychologically healthier, they tend to be more academically successful, because what it means is they've got this thing that they're going towards, and so they're more motivated in their schoolwork, to do well in their schoolwork, and they also, along the way, they develop particular skills that are useful in their schoolwork as well, so they're able to persevere more. They've got a greater sense of gratitude, they've got better social skills as well. Yes? Yes, yeah, I will, in this slide I will, so yes, thank you. So there was a study done with about 1,200 students ages 12 to 24, I believe, about purpose. How much purpose do you have in your life? And they found that the students really lumped into 4 different categories. So the first were students were disengaged. This was about 25% of the students. These were the students who just had no sense of purpose. They didn't know why they were existing. They didn't know what their schoolwork was for, and they didn't care. They weren't looking for it. It was just how they were, totally disengaged. The next were dreamers. These were ones who they were interested. They had some interests, but they really weren't doing anything to pursue them whatsoever at all. Dabblers, these are ones who they knew what they were interested in, and here and there they might try something, but they weren't totally focused in going for it. Purposeful, these are the ones who have a sense of purpose and they are really, really going for it. So these are 2 extreme examples of people who have a lot of purpose, but I like to use them because it started from a young age. So of course this is Malala Yousafzai, who is a great advocate of girls' education. And so she had that sense of purpose from a very young age, that she was going to promote girls' education. And so everything she was doing was driven towards that purpose. This, does anyone recognize who that is? I don't know if you would. This is the conductor of the Los Angeles Philharmonic, Gustavo Dudamel. He's from Venezuela. He was part of the music program that Venezuela has that teaches all children instruments when they're young. And he was so passionate about music that he got hired as a conductor at a very young age. I think he was like 25 or 26. But his passion when he's conducting the orchestra is just phenomenal, to the point where it makes the front cover of the LA Times when he falls off the podium, because he gets so excited. So again, 2 very extreme examples, and it doesn't necessarily have to be towards a cause. A student's purpose can be something to the effect of, I want to be a really good human being and have a wonderful family and really support my family. It can be something like that. It doesn't have to be this great save the world kind of thing, but it's just this general idea of what really matters to you, what are you passionate about, what's important to you, and having a clear sense of that. So one way, one of these emotions that Dacker talks about in his book, where students might start to get that sense of purpose, is through the emotion awe. So I'm just going to talk about awe for a little bit, but first I'd like to start by showing you this video. As you watch this video, I'd like you just to notice, if you feel any kind of physical or emotional kind of experiences in your body. Raise your hand if you really felt some sort of physical, emotional, or mental sort of hands watching that a little bit. Okay, all right. So this was a video that the researchers used in the lab to try to induce awe in the participants. This is a whole new area of research, and it's really, really exciting when they're starting to find awe. So the experience of awe, it starts with a sense of vastness. And it doesn't have to be physical vastness. It can be mental vastness. It can be acoustic vastness. But you get some sort of sense of vastness. And then it changes your perspective on the world and your place in it. So awe really requires what's called accommodation. It gives you a new way of looking at the world, looking at where you fit into it as well. It's really an extraordinary emotion. I've watched the video thousands of times, and I still get affected. So some of the mental, physical effects of awe, you might get goosebumps, an expansive feeling, warm feeling in your chest. It also can lessen your focus on the self and highlight your common humanity, how we're all in this together. It can connect us to something larger than ourselves. It also has been shown to increase our altruism, our sense of time, our sense of well-being. Also, another really interesting finding, I hope I'm going to explain this right, is inflammation in our bodies. Again, I'm not a medical doctor in any way, shape, or form, but whatever it is that's causing inflammation in our bodies, the researchers on awe have been looking at the experience of different positive emotions, and decreasing that inflammation. So they looked at things like compassion, generosity, awe, and they found that awe was the only positive emotion that actually decreased the inflammation in our body, or whatever it is, the cells that cause that inflammation in our body, which is really interesting for health implications. Let's see. Oh, let me use my computer to advance it. Oh, it's totally frozen. Let's see. Sorry, take a moment, enjoy your awe. Let's see here. Wait, it's advancing on this, but it's not advancing. There we go. There we go. Okay, I think we got it. Okay, so the question then is, what can actually generate awe? What I'd like you to do, just because you've been sitting for a while, I'd like you to stand up. Oh, that. So I'd like you to stand up and find a partner and stand back to back, and then I'll give you instructions for what's next. So go ahead, stand What was happening? Were people with you? Where were you? How did it make you feel? Really try to relive that experience in your mind. And when I play the chime, that's your cue to turn to the person, turn to your partner, and take about a minute each to describe that awe experience to each other in as great a detail as you can. Yeah, it's really something. It's very powerful how we can relive those emotions within ourselves, which is wonderful. I'm just curious to hear from 3 people, very briefly, what experience cultivated awe in you? What brought out awe in you? Anyone want to share?
I have a question for yourself.
Yes.
Amongst men, would they say the biggest awe moment is the birth of their children?
You know, I get that all the time in workshops when I ask people, but they have not looked at that in the lab. So I couldn't say whether or not that's true, but people all the time say it was the birth of my child that induced awe. So
Much more enjoyable for the mother.
good to know. I will tell that to the researchers. Anyone else want to share what brought awe into their lives? New invention? Uh-huh. Okay, so something that just seems so simple and so obvious that it makes sense. Okay, thank you. One more person. Anyone else want to share? Yes?
Music. A lot of
Music.
balance for me. So I'm curious if there's research related to that as well.
Well, what they found so far, again, we're talking about this is very, very early research. Nature, putting people in nature makes sense. The arts, so that would be music, absolutely. That sense of playing in an orchestra or just listening to music can bring on. How about you? But listening to Beethoven's Ninth is unbelievable for me. People, this was a really interesting one. Thinking about great people who have done these extraordinary things with their lives. It can give a sense of awe as well. And then grand theories. So, ideas about that really shift how we think about the world, how we think about ourselves as well. So, and I'm sure there are just tons of other things that induce awe as well, but they just, again, the research is so new. So then, what does this actually mean for our children, for our students? Our children, I asked Dacker, who's the main researcher on awe, about the experience of awe in children. And he said, we don't know a whole lot yet. Most of it's been done with adults. But he said, one reason he thinks that awe can be such a whopper for adults is because we have this very complex understanding of the world. So when we see something that really shifts our thinking, it's a really powerful emotion. But I've talked to a lot of teachers and they say, I see awe in my children all the time. So it's not something that's just for adults as well. So, but awe, because it can connect us to something larger than ourselves and make us feel our common humanity, awe might very well be an emotion that our students, our children experience that can give them a sense of purpose. Think about taking a child out into nature. And for some reason, all of a sudden, they're just overwhelmed by it, that they get this awe experience, and they feel very connected to it, and now they want to be an environmentalist. They want to do something to help the environment. Whatever it might be, whatever that experience might be, and it's important for us as adults to be on the lookout for that, because children do need help developing a sense of purpose. We, the adults, can't give our children their purpose. It has to come from them. It can't come from their teachers, it can't come from their parents, because they won't be motivated. If we give it to them, they won't be motivated to go towards that. It has to come from them. So if your child says, my sense of purpose is to become a rock star, that's okay. I would say let them do that, because even if they never become a rock star, they're going to learn things. They're going to get a sense of what that feels like to go for a goal that they're passionate about, something they're passionate about. And maybe they will become a rock star, you don't know, but most likely they'll go in another direction and they'll know what that feels like to be passionate about something. So I love this example. I think that, yes?
A question. The lady underneath Hatman?
That's Harriet Tubman. She, it's a very American thing, I should have changed the picture, but she was very instrumental in helping U.S. slaves in the 19th century in the Underground Railroad escape from the south to the north.
And people are also aware that Einstein was a dyslexic.
Oh, it was dyslexic, so there you go, even more. So thank you. Yes?
Okay, I'll go back to the video that you just showed.
Yeah.
What if you haven't showed it before? This type of have you ever get a negative impact? People who watch it and feel insignificant because it's just big and major and just a negative feeling instead of some positive.
Right, exactly. They've looked at that very, very briefly in terms of like spiritual experiences, that sometimes it can be so awesome that it's scary. It's actually frightening. But the way the researchers are looking at awe, they're looking at more the positive experience of awe rather than the negative, what you're talking about, the overwhelming. They just haven't gotten there yet in their research, so we don't know a whole lot about it yet. Okay, so this is a student who I think experienced awe and then discovered a purpose with it. This is from, anyone familiar with Humans of New York, the Facebook page, where there's a young man who goes around, takes pictures of people on the streets of New York and throughout the world actually, and then asks them very personal questions and then puts snippets of it on Facebook. So this young man said, I want to be a hematologist. That's a blood doctor. Well, not a blood doctor exactly, but a doctor that finds cures for blood diseases. Well, how'd you decide on that? We were dissecting frogs in class and learning about how the blood flows through the body, and I went home that night and wrote an essay. And it wasn't like any other essay I'd ever done. Normally when I write essays, it takes me a long time, but this was the fastest essay I ever wrote. So the next day I was asking the teacher mad questions, and she was like, you can get a job in this. And she pulled it up on the internet and was showing me all about hematologists. So here's a student who probably experienced awe at dissecting this frog, and it sparked something in him, and he was just crazy about it. And thank goodness he had an adult in his life who was able to recognize that spark and say, okay, go in this direction. So, I love this example. So then what happens next? So a child's got a sense of purpose in their life. So the next area to really look at is this idea of self-awareness and self-management, because a lot of kids, they'll get that sense of purpose. They know what they want to go for, but maybe they've got some internal stuff going on. Maybe they've got a fear of failure. Maybe they don't really know how to start, whatever it might be. And so this is where these skills, these social emotional skills of self-awareness, social awareness can really help kids move towards that sense of purpose. So with self-awareness and self-management, I like to start with mindfulness. How many of you are familiar with mindfulness, maybe have a mindfulness practice? A little bit here and there? Okay, so it's nothing new. It actually grew out of spiritual traditions from the East. But the way that it's been brought into the U.S. and into schools and into organizations, it's been very secularized. So all the spiritual aspects of it have been taken away. So mindfulness is both a practice and a way of life. And the way that we define it is the awareness that arises out of intentionally paying attention in an open, kind, and discerning way. So again, it's a practice and it's a way of life. It's a way of being in the moment. It's a way of being aware of what's going on inside of us. Because if we're not aware of what's going on inside of us, we're not aware of our emotions and our thoughts and how those are impacting us, that will actually control us rather than we controlling them. So that will control our reactions, our actions. Whereas mindfulness, both living mindfully, being present in the moment, and being aware of what's going on inside of you and around you, and then the practice of it, which helps strengthen that ability, that helps us gain control of our inner life. So just to show some of you how mindfulness can actually help. So how often have you said something that you wish you could take back, or felt nervous or anxious about a presentation, maybe been in a bad mood but not sure why, or what the emotion was? Notice that you do much better when you are really focused. So these are things that the practice of mindfulness can actually help us with. And interestingly, there's been a ton of research on mindfulness now in the last 10 years in all areas of life. And it's found again and again to help our health, our well-being. It can actually help us become more empathetic, more compassionate towards others. So a lot of benefits, and there's starting to be research on mindfulness in education as well. So children who are taught mindfulness and practice it in schools, it shows to improve their attention and also their relationships with others. So just to give you an idea of how mindfulness helps us with our emotions, I want to just walk you through what's actually going on inside of us when we have an emotional response. So it starts over here on the left side. Something happens in our inner or outer environment. Maybe we have a thought or an emotion or a memory that comes up. Or maybe something happens on the outside. Maybe we get caught in a traffic jam or somebody says something to us that's not nice. Something happens. Whatever it is that happens, that gets filtered through our database within ourselves. And it's in this emotional database where we keep our memories, where we keep our scripts, how do we talk to ourselves, what are our beliefs, what are the themes that we live with through our lives. So for example, an example I like to use, let's say you're at work and one of your colleagues says something not very nice to you, and that colleague just happens to remind you of a family member you didn't like very much. That's getting filtered through your script, so maybe you start to blow it out of proportion. As that experience gets filtered through the database, we get an emotional trigger. This whole process right here happens in a fraction of a second. So think about a time that maybe you or someone you love or your child just kind of flew off the handle and you're not sure exactly what happened. This is what was going on. So when we have an emotional trigger, we generally have a couple different ways that we can respond. Many of us either react, which is where we have that expression of anger or fear or whatever it might be, or we suppress. This is where we won't look at the emotion, we just push it down inside of us, we won't deal with it, we're not even aware that maybe we're even feeling an emotion. Neither of these are really positive responses. So a lot of times if we have that strong reaction, we might say something that we really, really regret. If we suppress, the research shows that if you have enough suppression, eventually that there's so much that it can lead to anxiety and depression because you haven't processed those emotions. You've got to feel it and let it go. So those are generally the not so great ways to deal with emotions. This way, with mindfulness, what it can help us do is it can help us stop. We become aware that this emotional trigger is about to happen. And we can take a deep breath, maybe take a step back, consider the situation, and then make a better choice of how to actually respond. It can take a lot of practice to actually get to this point, but both living mindfully and also the practice of mindfulness can help build our ability to do this instead of doing this. Okay, so I just want to show you how this actually can work in our emotional life. Another way that mindfulness can help us, so this is really important with our children, with resilience. So resilience is the ability to bounce back from a challenging situation. The quicker you can bounce back, the more resilient you are in general. So what the researchers have found, they've located where resilience, the ability to be resilient, lies in the brain, and it involves both our prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So the prefrontal cortex I mentioned earlier, that's the part of our brain where we have our executive functions, our thinking, our decision-making skills, that kind of thing. The amygdala, right there in the center of the brain, that is the part that really stores our emotional memories. It stores our emotions, our emotional reactions. When you have something negative that happens to you, that amygdala generally fires off. That's what's causing that emotional trigger. Hopefully, the prefrontal cortex will then get online and you're able to use reasoning, you're able to use your cognitive abilities to calm that amygdala down. People who are not resilient, they tend to have low activity in the prefrontal cortex, or they have weak connections between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. So their amygdala fires off, but they can't get that prefrontal cortex online in order to help them calm down. What they have found is that the practice of mindfulness increases the activity in the prefrontal cortex and also strengthens the connections between these two areas. And there's actually a study that shows that mindfulness also can actually shrink the amygdala. So those emotional triggers get less intense as well. So another, just very basic way of how mindfulness can actually help us. So tons and tons of mindfulness practices out there. There's sitting practice, there's walking, there's loving kindness where you're consciously developing compassion for others. So I'm not going to say, because we've got such limited time, I'm not going to say a lot more about mindfulness, but any questions before I move on to the next? Yes?
Go back a couple of slides.
Go back?
Go back again. The emotional word, you're talking about unconscious bias. Are you talking about unconscious bias?
Unconscious bias?
Yeah.
Yes.
Is that what you are talking about or not?
Unconscious bias. Yes, it can be. It can be here. Yes.
It's only part of it.
I'm sorry?
But it's only part of it.
It's only part of it.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, exactly. It's also our memories, it's also our, yeah, exactly. So yes, so unconscious bias. Okay. Okay, so then what are some other ways that we can actually deal with when we get these emotional responses? Maybe if kids have a fear of failure or something like that. one of the most powerful things that's starting to emerge from the research is self-compassion. So self-compassion, anyone familiar with self-compassion? The idea a little bit here, Miriam? Okay. So self-compassion is that practice of quieting the inner critic, replacing it with a voice of support, understanding, and care for oneself. So when you do something, or you mess up, or you fail at something, or something goes wrong, a lot of us have the habit of beating ourselves up because we think that's how we need to respond in order to motivate ourselves. But what the researchers are saying is that self-compassion, being kind to yourself when things happen like that, it's actually more effective. So instead of doing this, self-compassion actually helps us do that. Because what's happening when we beat ourselves up is we're actually releasing a little bit of cortisol in our bodies. So we're increasing our anxiety. So whereas self-compassion, that can keep that experience from happening. So we're able to stay calm and then look at a situation much more realistically and say, okay, what happened here? I'm okay, I mess up. Now maybe we can look at things and see how we can change it. Interestingly, because of the interest of time, if you don't mind, I'm just going to skip this slide. So interestingly, the research on self-compassion was started by a person named Kristen Neff. And when she started looking at it, she saw that there was absolutely no research whatsoever on self-compassion. So she started looking at self-esteem, because that was like the ultimate marker of well-being. And what she found was that, in general, self-esteem is a global evaluation of self-worth, that we are good people. And what she's found is that there were tons and tons of research, tons and tons of books on self-esteem. Parents encourage their kids to have high self-esteem. Teachers did. But she said that researchers recently have really started to fall out of love with the idea of self-esteem. And it's not that you have it. It's good to have self-esteem, to feel good about yourself. It's how we get it. So she said, and this is US based, most of her research is US based. So again, we have to consider the cultural context of this. So speaking from that culture, in the US, in order to have high self-esteem, you have to consider that you are special and above average. The problem, though, with being special and above average, or having to feel that way, is that we can't always be special and above average. If you were to tell a doctor, well, you're an average doctor, how does that make the doctor feel? It's not very good. So instead what we do is we start to engage in these psychological machinations in order to keep our self-esteem high. So one thing that we do is we attach our self-worth to things that are really, really important to us. So as I mentioned before, things like academic success, or maybe feeling attractive, or being successful at your work, whatever it might be. The challenge is, though, is that when you don't do well in one of those areas, because it's linked to your self-worth, you're going to beat yourself up really, really hard. The crash is hard when you don't do well. The other thing that we do is we start to do social comparison. So we compare ourselves to other people in those areas of importance. So a student might compare him or herself to another student and say, well, I'm doing better than that student. So I'm better. So that actually beats that other person down. And that's one reason why researchers think that the level of narcissism in the United States is actually really skyrocketed in the last 20 years or so, is because of this movement of self-esteem. So to give you an example of these psychological machinations, I'd love to use this example. So Victoria's Secret, lowering women's self-esteem since 1977. So again, social comparison. So the difference is with this way of boosting our self-esteem versus self-compassion. What self-compassion does is it allows ourselves to realize we are human. And that we've got this common humanity, and that we're all in this together. We all make mistakes. None of us are perfect. And just being kind to yourself and relating to yourself as a human being. And I love what Kristen Neff writes. She says, you realize that your true value lies in the core experience of being a conscious being who feels and perceives. So it's not that you're really, really good in these different areas. You have value solely for the fact that you are a human being. So much easier to practice self-compassion with that. Yes?
What about for people that you have in your life that might beat themselves up really, really badly? Can you model self-compassion by rather than saying, oh, I did this, but you can say, no, it was this when they start to
If you're doing it as for yourself.
I just wonder how you model that, like how would I teach that to a child?
Right, exactly. So what I would do is I would model it within your own life. So one of the ways to teach something like emotional literacy about emotions is when you get upset or when you feel a strong emotion, talk about it with your child. So, oh, I feel really angry right now, and I think it's because of this, this, and this, and I'm going to take a deep breath and calm myself down. I mean, that's just straight up modeling, talking through it. So same exact thing with self-compassion. Oh, I really messed up. I was late for this. Oh, but you know what? I'm not a bad person. People are late. It happens. That's okay. So I think the modeling and the talking through it really, really helps. So that's a great question. So some practices of self-compassion. Kristen Neff has wonderful practices. She's got a website on self-compassion and a book that I recommend on how to practice self-compassion. So one is talking to yourself as you would a best friend. This is a great, great practice to do. You can, she also says you can write yourself a letter. So take a difficult situation that you're dealing with right now in your life and imagine how would you respond to maybe if your best friend or your child came to you with that situation. You're not going to yell at that person or your child or beat them up or any way. That's just not what we do. So then why do we do it to ourselves? So imagine talking to ourselves as we would talk to a best friend about that situation. Very understanding, very compassionate. Another one is self-squeeze. This is one that she says you can kind of do in the moment. If you're like having a difficult conversation with somebody, you can just kind of, this is a little bit too much, but she says you can just kind of pat yourself like this and say, you know what, I'm okay. I'm all right, everything's okay, we're fine. Another one is breathing in, breathing out compassion. Again, this is in the moment, maybe with a difficult person, difficult conversation. If you can remember just as you're listening or talking, you can remember to breathe in compassion for yourself and breathe out compassion for the other person. And what it does is it calms down those emotions that might be rising in you so that you can take a better, you can have a better response as well. All right, we only have a couple more minutes. So we move through this. So the last one is social awareness and relationship management. Very quickly, empathy. Empathy is what connects us to each other. It's both our ability to understand how another person might feel and also an emotional response to how a person might feel. So it's both cognitive and emotional as well. So interestingly though, empathy, a lot of people think that empathy is great, that's all you need is to cultivate empathy for other people, you're connected, you know how to get along well, not quite so quickly. Empathy can be used in 4 different ways. The first is empathy can actually be used for bad purposes. People can be empathetic, they can understand how another person feels and use that to manipulate another person. So again, you've got to have that pro-social lens to it, you know, put those values underneath it, that ethical framework. It also can lead to personal distress. You can see this a lot in children, in people who are in caregiving professions, where we get overloaded with another person's emotions. It's too much for us to handle it, so we can't do anything to help. We have to walk away and take care of ourselves and just survive ourselves. So it can also lead to that. It also can be neutral. It's just information. You understand how the person feels. But then it can also lead to compassion, and that's really where you want it to go, is to compassion if it's a difficult situation. So compassion, I'm going to skip that. Oh, sorry, I ran out of time. But let's see here. Oh, I don't have a slide on that. I'm sorry. All right, I will take you through this then. So compassion, what compassion is you know, with empathy, I talked about the pain centers lighting up in our brain. With compassion, when you are compassionate towards another person, you actually get the reward center in your brain lights up. You get a little boost of positive emotions. So that's what can encourage us to continue being compassionate for each other. So developing empathy and compassion in our children and in ourselves. Actively imagine how another person is feeling. Ask your child, how do you think that person's feeling? Read a book together. How do you think this character is feeling? Playing games. The researchers have found that when we play games with other people, we have to kind of figure out how are they feeling in order to figure out their next move. So it can actually increase our empathy. Emotional literacy, so this is recognizing our emotions, understanding them, handling them. Mindfulness can build it. Not jumping to conclusions. A lot of times we jump to conclusions about another person. We think that maybe they deserve their suffering and we're less likely to feel empathy and compassion for them. Looking for our commonalities. If somebody doesn't look like us, And this is a lot where the unconscious bias can come in. But if somebody doesn't look like us, we tend to have less empathy and compassion for them. Also seeing people as individuals. You know, a lot of times we see large groups of people who are suffering, and it's very hard for us to have compassion for them. I think a really interesting thing that's happening right now with all of the refugees pouring into Europe is that it's such a mass of people that it's hard to understand and have compassion for this huge mass of people. But the Humans of New York person who I showed you before went over there and he talked to individual refugees and he took pictures of them and he gave them snippets of their story, and you cannot believe the empathetic responses of the people who read these stories, and it put a face on that suffering, made it much more personal. Know that you're capable of making a difference. Know that you can do something to help, and then modeling compassion as well. We have a few more minutes? 1 more minute? Okay. Oh, I'm so sorry. I wanted to take you through all of this. So the last one is gratitude. Gratitude is something so simple, but it connects us to each other as well. It's an affirmation of goodness, that there are good things in the world, gifts and benefits we've received. So what gratitude does is it can strengthen our social ties because we realize we're interconnected. It also, interestingly, can increase our self-worth because somebody did something for us that was so kind. It means that we're a valuable person. They've done some studies with students, middle school students and teenagers who have high levels of gratitude, and it's very, very beneficial. A very simple practice of gratitude that people can do at home is when you're sitting around the dinner table once a week, just say, okay, let's go around and let's talk about what are we most grateful for. Just say one thing. Very, very easy practice. So I'm sorry I ran out of time. You've been a lovely, lovely audience. And if you have any questions, I'll be here. So thank you so, so much. I appreciate it.
Wow.